The autumn sun hung low over Camp Hearn, Texas, on the afternoon of October 15, 1943, when a group of German prisoners of war filed through the gates under armed escort. They were heading to something the American guards called a rodeo, a word none of them had heard before. These men, most of them veterans of Rommel's Afrika Korps, had surrendered in Tunisia just months earlier. They had crossed an ocean in the holds of Liberty ships, travelled by train through landscapes so vast they seemed impossible, and now found themselves in a place that bore no resemblance to any battlefield they had known. The guards were grinning, joking among themselves in that casual American way the prisoners found both unsettling and oddly reassuring. One of the Germans, a former sergeant named Klaus Becker, would later write in his diary that he assumed they were being taken to observe some kind of cavalry training exercise. After all, what else would involve horses, dust, and assembled crowds of military personnel? What Becker and his fellow prisoners witnessed that afternoon would fundamentally challenge their understanding of American military culture, national character, and the very nature of the war they had been fighting. They expected to see mounted soldiers practicing maneuvers. Instead, they saw something that seemed to defy military logic entirely. Men risking their lives for no apparent tactical purpose, crowds cheering for individual achievement rather than unit cohesion, and a celebration of danger that served no strategic objective. The confusion on their faces was so evident that one American guard later recalled asking a German prisoner what he thought of the show. The prisoner responded in halting English. This misunderstanding, this collision between German military expectations and American cultural reality, reveals something profound about the two nations at war. For the German prisoners, everything was supposed to serve the state, the military, the collective war effort. Entertainment and military function were not separate categories in their worldview. How could Americans afford to waste time, resources, and risk injury on something that served no military purpose? The answer to that question, and the prisoners' gradual comprehension of what a rodeo actually represented, would become, for many of them, the first crack in the ideological foundation of everything they had been taught about America, about warfare, and about the inevitable triumph of German arms. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. To understand why these German soldiers misread the rodeo so completely, we must first understand who they were and what they had been taught. The men of the Afrika Korps were not the fanatical SS troops of popular imagination. Most were regular Wehrmacht soldiers, conscripts and volunteers who had believed, at least initially, in the Nazi narrative of German superiority and American weakness. They had been told repeatedly that Americans were soft, individualistic, and incapable of the collective sacrifice necessary for modern warfare. Joseph Goebbels' propaganda ministry had spent years painting a picture of the United States as a mongrel nation, divided by class and race, more interested in Hollywood fantasies and consumer goods than in the harsh realities of total war. The propaganda was not entirely without basis in selective observation. America in the 1930s had indeed been racked by the Great Depression, labor strikes, and social unrest. German intelligence had monitored American reluctance to enter the war, the isolationist movements, the America First rallies. They had collected photographs of breadlines and Hoovervilles. They had documented the racial segregation that divided the American South. All of this fed into a narrative that became gospel within the German military. America might have industrial capacity, but it lacked the will, the unity, and the martial spirit necessary to defeat the disciplined forces of the Third Reich. This narrative was reinforced by the structure of German military culture itself. The Wehrmacht emphasized hierarchy, obedience, and the subordination of individual desire to collective purpose. Entertainment for German soldiers was carefully managed, organized performances, mandatory political education sessions, communal singing of approved songs. The idea of soldiers or citizens engaging in dangerous activities purely for personal glory and public entertainment would have struck German military planners as wasteful at best, subversive at worst. Recreation was meant to restore fighting efficiency, not to celebrate individual risk-taking outside the context of military necessity. When the Afrika Korps surrendered in Tunisia in May of 1943, more than 275,000 Axis troops fell into Allied hands. For the Americans, this created an immediate logistical crisis. The United States had never held large numbers of foreign prisoners of war. The War Department had to rapidly construct a network of camps across the country, and Texas, with its vast open spaces and climate similar to North Africa, became a primary destination. The Geneva Convention of 1929 required that prisoners be housed in conditions similar to those of the capturing army and in climates comparable to where they were captured. Thus, German soldiers who had fought in the deserts of Libya and Tunisia found themselves in the deserts and prairies of Texas. The camps themselves were hastily constructed, but substantial. Camp Hearn, established in late 1942 in Robertson County, eventually held more than 4,800 prisoners. It consisted of over 250 buildings, spread across 700 acres, surrounded by double barbed wire fences, watchtowers, and floodlights. Yet, despite the security measures, the camps bore little resemblance to the harsh conditions the Germans had expected. The barracks were wooden structures with proper roofs, heating, and ventilation. Prisoners received 3 meals a day that, by German wartime standards, were lavish. They had access to canteens where they could purchase tobacco, toiletries, and other goods with the 80 cents per day they earned for voluntary labor. They could receive mail from home, send letters under certain restrictions, and even attend educational classes. The contrast with conditions in Germany was stark and, for many prisoners, deeply unsettling. By late 1943, German civilians were enduring increasingly severe rationing. Allied bombing raids were devastating cities, and the Eastern Front was consuming men and materiel at a horrifying rate. Letters from home spoke of hunger, fear, and loss. Yet here in Texas, enemy prisoners were eating white bread, fresh meat, and vegetables daily. They were sleeping in heated buildings, playing soccer on organized fields, and watching American movies on Saturday nights. Some prisoners called it the Fritz Ritz, a bitter joke that acknowledged the cognitive dissonance of their situation. How could the soft Americans be winning the war if they could afford to treat enemy prisoners so well? The answer, of course, lay in America's massive industrial and agricultural capacity, a capacity that German intelligence had consistently underestimated. While Germany struggled to feed its population and military, the United States was producing such agricultural surpluses that feeding prisoners of war created no meaningful strain on the system. The camps weren't acts of charity. They were simply the natural byproduct of an economy operating at unprecedented levels of output. Every Liberty ship that carried prisoners to America returned to Europe loaded with the tanks, trucks, aircraft, and supplies that were grinding down the Wehrmacht. But this reality was difficult for prisoners to grasp, especially in the early months of their captivity. Their ideological training had not prepared them for abundance in the land of the enemy. It was into this context of confusion and cognitive dissonance that the rodeo invitation arrived. The Texas prison rodeo at Huntsville had been running since 1931, and by the 1940s, it had become a major regional event, drawing tens of thousands of spectators every October. Prison officials had discovered that allowing select prisoners of war to attend local events served multiple purposes. It provided a reward for good behavior, it helped alleviate the crushing boredom of camp life, and it offered opportunities for the re-education program that American authorities were beginning to implement. The theory was that exposing German prisoners to American life, its prosperity, its diversity, its apparent contradictions, would begin to erode their faith in Nazi ideology. For the prisoners boarding the trucks that October afternoon, the trip itself was revelatory. The roads were paved and well maintained. They passed farms with modern tractors sitting in fields, houses with electric lights visible even in daylight, automobiles that seemed to be everywhere despite the war. One prisoner later wrote that he had expected America to show visible signs of strain from the war effort, empty roads, darkened buildings, evidence of rationing and sacrifice. Instead, everything seemed normal, abundant, functioning. This was not what they had been told to expect. The prison at Huntsville was itself an oddity. The German prisoners watched as American convicts, men imprisoned for crimes against their own society, were being organized for what appeared to be some kind of military exercise. The prisoners saw the bulls and horses in pens, the riding equipment being prepared, the crowds gathering in wooden stands. The logical assumption, given their military training and world-view, was that this was cavalry preparation. Perhaps these convicts were being trained for military service as punishment or as a path to redemption. Perhaps this was how America dealt with its criminal class, by militarizing them. The German military had historical precedents for such thinking. Prussian military tradition included the concept of penal battalions, Strafbataillon, where soldiers guilty of offences were sent to perform especially dangerous duties. The idea that a nation might use convicts for military purposes was not foreign to German thinking. What they were about to witness, however, would shatter that interpretation entirely. When the rodeo began, the German prisoners watched in silent confusion as the first cowboy mounted a bronco. The horse exploded from the chute, bucking and twisting with violent force. The rider lasted, perhaps 6 seconds before being thrown into the dust. The crowd roared with approval. Another rider entered the arena. The same violent dance. The same result. Over and over, men mounted animals that seemed designed to throw them, with no apparent objective beyond staying mounted for a few seconds. There were no formations, no unit cohesion, no officers directing tactics. Each man competed individually, and the crowd cheered whether the rider succeeded or failed, as long as the attempt was spectacular. Klaus Becker, watching from the stands, turned to a fellow prisoner and asked in German, "What is the military purpose of this?" His companion, a former corporal named Wilhelm Strasser, could only shake his head. They watched as the bull riding began even more violent, even more apparently pointless. Men were being thrown into the air, landing hard, sometimes limping from the arena while the crowd applauded. One prisoner asked an American guard why the men were being punished. The guard laughed and explained that they weren't being punished, they were volunteering for this. They wanted to do it. For money, certainly, but more importantly, for glory, for pride, for the respect of their peers and the crowd. This explanation made no sense within the German prisoners' framework of understanding. Why would men volunteer for injury? Why would a crowd celebrate individual risk-taking that served no collective purpose? And most baffling of all, why would the American military establishment, for surely this event required official approval and resources, allow such waste? The confusion deepened as the rodeo continued. The German prisoners observed events that seemed to grow progressively more chaotic and dangerous. In the hard money event, inmates competed to snatch a tobacco sack filled with cash from between the horns of an angry bull. Men sprinted across the arena, dodging the animal's charges, risking trampling and goring for what appeared to be small amounts of currency. The crowd screamed encouragement. Some inmates succeeded, holding their prize aloft, while the bull chased them to the fence. Others were knocked down, forced to scramble away while rodeo clowns distracted the animal. Becker noted in his diary that evening, "Today we witnessed what the Americans call a rodeo. The men risk serious injury for small rewards and the approval of strangers. There is no apparent training value. The techniques used would be useless in cavalry combat. The horses and bulls are not being trained for any military purpose, quite the opposite. They are selected and encouraged to be uncontrollable. I asked the guard if these men were volunteers or if this was a form of punishment. He assured me they were volunteers. Some had been competing for years. I do not understand this country." The misunderstanding was not universal among the prisoners. Some had travelled more widely before the war, had read more extensively, or were simply more observant. These men began to piece together what they were seeing. This was entertainment, pure and simple. It was a cultural tradition from the American West, a celebration of cowboy mythology that was woven through American popular culture. It had nothing to do with military training. But even for those who grasped the basic nature of the rodeo, questions remained. How could a nation at war afford such frivolity? How could it allow men, even prisoners, to risk injury in activities unrelated to the war effort? And what did it mean that thousands of civilians would gather to watch this, would pay money to attend, would bring their families to see men risk their lives for no purpose beyond spectacle. The answers to these questions lay in fundamental differences between American and German societies, differences that went far deeper than the prisoners initially realized. The rodeo was not an aberration or a wartime morale event. It was a manifestation of values that had existed in American culture long before the war and would persist long after. The celebration of individual achievement, the romanticization of dangerous and economically irrational behavior, the clear separation between military function and civilian entertainment, these were not weaknesses in the American system. They were features, products of a society organized on fundamentally different principles than Nazi Germany. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The German prisoners had been trained in a worldview where everything served the state. Recreation was valuable, insofar as it restored worker productivity or soldier effectiveness. Art was judged by its contribution to national morale or political indoctrination. Even sports were organized around the concept of national glory. The 1936 Berlin Olympics had been explicitly designed to demonstrate Aryan superiority. The idea that something could be valuable simply because people enjoyed it, that individuals might choose to do dangerous things for no reason beyond personal satisfaction, was alien to the totalitarian mindset. American culture, by contrast, had been built on a mythology of individualism that the rodeo perfectly embodied. The cowboy was a central figure in American folklore, the lone man facing nature and danger without support from collective institutions, succeeding or failing based on personal skill and courage. This mythology was economically irrational even in the 19th century American West, where the actual work of cattle ranching was far more mundane and cooperative than the dime novels suggested. But the mythology persisted because it reflected something Americans wanted to believe about themselves: that individual initiative and courage mattered, that a man could make his own destiny, that glory was available to anyone brave enough to take the risk. The rodeo transformed this mythology into public spectacle. It took the most dangerous moments of cowboy work, breaking wild horses, controlling cattle, and turned them into competitions where success was measured in seconds and determined by a combination of skill, courage, and luck. Importantly, Rodeo's success carried no official sanction. There were no government agencies promoting rodeo champions, no state apparatus claiming their victories for national glory. A rodeo cowboy was famous because other cowboys and spectators recognized his skill. His rewards came from the community, not from the state. For the German prisoners watching at Huntsville, this represented a category of human behavior they had not been taught to recognize. Under Nazi ideology, individual action was valuable only insofar as it served the Volk, the people, understood as a racial and national collective. A soldier's courage was meaningful because it contributed to German victory. A worker's productivity was important because it strengthened the nation. Art, sport, entertainment, all were evaluated based on their contribution to national power and racial purity. The concept that something could be valuable simply because free individuals chose to participate in it, free spectators chose to watch it, and the state merely permitted rather than directed it, was incomprehensible. As the rodeo continued, the German prisoners began to notice other details that reinforced their confusion. The inmates competing were of various races: white, black, Hispanic. In Nazi racial theory, this mixing was a sign of American degeneracy, the mongrel nation's fatal weakness. Yet here, men of different races competed under the same rules, received the same prizes, and earned the same respect from the crowd, based solely on their performance. One German prisoner later wrote to a family member, "The Americans allow their Negroes to compete with white men in public spectacles. We were told this was impossible in their segregated society. I am beginning to doubt many things we were told." This observation was particularly significant because the German prisoners had indeed witnessed American racial segregation. On the train journey from the East Coast to Texas, they had seen separate facilities for black and white Americans, separate train cars, separate waiting rooms. Some prisoners had noted this with satisfaction. seeing it as confirmation of what Nazi propaganda had taught them about American racial divisions. But the rodeo revealed a more complex reality. Yes, American society was racially segregated and deeply unjust. But within certain contexts, sports, competition, military service performance could sometimes transcend racial barriers in ways that German racial ideology claimed were impossible. The prisoners watched as the rodeo progressed through various events. Calf roping demonstrated the practical ranching skills that had given rise to rodeo competition. Steer, wrestling showed techniques for controlling large animals. Barrel racing displayed horsemanship and speed. Each event had roots in actual cowboy work, but had been transformed into stylized competitions judged on time and technique. The prisoners with cavalry experience could see the skill involved and could recognize the horsemanship required. But they could not reconcile the skill with the apparent purposelessness. Why perfect these techniques when modern warfare had made cavalry obsolete? What the prisoners failed to understand was that Americans were perfectly capable of distinguishing between cultural tradition and military necessity. The United States military was not training cavalry in any significant numbers by 1943. American armor and mechanized infantry had learned the lessons of Poland and France. The army was producing tank battalions, motorized artillery, and airborne divisions. But this had nothing to do with whether civilians attended rodeos or whether the rodeo tradition continued. The two existed in separate spheres. Military necessity did not consume every aspect of civilian life, even in wartime. This separation was itself revealing. German society under the Nazis had been progressively militarized since 1933. The Hitler Youth prepared boys for military service from age 10. Women's organizations were structured around supporting the war effort. Leisure activities were monitored and directed by party organizations. The concept of a civilian sphere independent from state control had been systematically eliminated. The total war that Nazi leadership demanded was not just a military strategy, but a social reality. Every German was a soldier in the racial struggle, whether they wore a uniform or not. American society, by contrast, remained fundamentally civilian in character even during total war. Yes, the draft pulled millions of men into military service. Yes, the industry was reorganized for war production. Yes, rationing affected daily life. But underneath these wartime measures, the basic structure of American society remained unchanged. People still attended rodeos. Hollywood still made movies. Professional baseball continued, though with depleted rosters. The state directed economic resources toward military victory, but it did not claim total control over the lives and leisure of citizens. For the German prisoners, this represented a profound cognitive challenge. They had been taught that total war required total mobilization, that half measures and divided loyalties would lead to defeat. Yet here was America, apparently fighting a two-front global war while maintaining cultural traditions that served no military purpose, allowing dangerous entertainment that risked injury to potential workers and soldiers, and preserving a sphere of civilian life that answered to market forces and personal choice, rather than state diktat. And America was winning. As the rodeo ended and the German prisoners boarded the trucks back to Camp Herne, they carried with them a collection of disturbing observations and unsettled assumptions. The conversations on the return journey were muted, thoughtful. Some prisoners clung to the initial interpretation. Surely there must be some military training value they had missed, some deeper purpose the Americans were concealing. But others, particularly those who had been in captivity longer or who were more willing to question what they had been taught, began to articulate a more unsettling conclusion. Maybe the propaganda had been wrong. Not just wrong about the rodeo, but wrong about America more fundamentally. Klaus Becker spent that evening and the following days talking with other prisoners, comparing observations, trying to make sense of what they had seen. He noted that some prisoners became angry when their assumptions were challenged, accusing duptas of defeatism or betrayal. These were often the most ideologically committed Nazis, men who needed the propaganda narrative to remain intact because their entire worldview depended on it. but others, perhaps the majority, were simply confused. They had fought for Germany out of patriotism, duty, or because they had no choice. They were not fanatics, and for these men, the rodeo became a symbol of something larger and more troubling, the possibility that everything they had been told about the enemy was false. The re-education program that American authorities implemented in POW camps was designed to exploit exactly this kind of cognitive dissonance. The program was controversial and operated in a legal grey area. The Geneva Convention prohibited coercive indoctrination of prisoners, but American officials argued they were simply providing access to information that had been denied to Germans under Nazi censorship. Prisoners were shown American newspapers and magazines. They attended lectures on American history and democracy. They watched documentary films about Allied military victories and, eventually, about the liberation of concentration camps. The rodeo visit was not officially part of the re-education program, but it served a similar function. It exposed prisoners to aspects of American life that contradicted the Nazi narrative. The abundance, the racial complexity, the individualism, the separation of civilian and military spheres, all of these challenged the totalitarian worldview. And because prisoners had seen these things with their own eyes rather than being told about them by captors, the impact was more profound than any lecture could achieve. Over the following months, Becker's diary entries reveal a gradual transformation in his thinking. He began noting other contradictions. The American guards were friendly when prisoners cooperated, joking and sometimes sharing cigarettes. Yet these same guards would shoot without hesitation, if a prisoner approached the fence line. The contradiction puzzled him until he realized it was not a contradiction at all. Americans distinguished between persons and roles in a way German military culture did not. A guard could be friendly with a prisoner as one human to another, while still being absolutely committed to preventing escape as a matter of duty. The person was not the role. He noticed that American officers did not expect or receive the kind of rigid deference that German officers demanded. Enlisted men addressed officers with respect, but without servility. Decisions were sometimes questioned or discussed rather than simply obeyed. Yet American units functioned effectively, perhaps more effectively than German units where questioning an order could result in severe punishment. How was this possible? How could an army function without the rigid hierarchy and unquestioning obedience that German military theory claimed were essential? He observed American prisoners working alongside German prisoners in the camp workshops and farms. Some Americans were German-speaking children of immigrants or men who had studied the language. These men sometimes talked with the German prisoners about their lives before the war, their families, their hopes for after the war. Becker was struck by how ordinary they were, how similar to his own family and neighbors back home. This was the enemy? These farmers and factory workers who talked about baseball and complained about army food? Where were the plutocratic warmongers and Jewish conspirators that Goebbels had promised? The psychological crisis that some prisoners experienced was not primarily about military defeat. By late 1943, most German soldiers understood that the war was not going as promised. The Eastern Front was a horror. North Africa was lost. Italy was collapsing. Defeat was becoming imaginable. But defeat was a military question. What the rodeo and the broader American experience revealed was more fundamental. The entire ideological framework within which they had understood the war might be false. If America was not the weak, divided, mongrel nation they had been told about, if Americans were not the inferior people that Nazi racial theory insisted they were, then what did that mean about Germany? About the causes they had fought for? About the years of sacrifice and loss? They became eager participants in the re-education program, consuming American books and newspapers, attending lectures, and eventually helping to produce anti-Nazi publications for distribution in camps after the war in Germany. These men were called anti-Fas by their fellow prisoners, short for anti-fascists. They risked violence from hardcore Nazis in the camps. Several prisoners in various American camps were murdered by fellow Germans for being too cooperative with captors or for expressing doubts about Nazi ideology. For others, the psychological adjustment was more gradual and ambiguous. They did not become ideological converts to American democracy. But they quietly abandoned their faith in Nazi ideology. They focused on survival, on maintaining connections with family at home, on trying to imagine a future after the war. They participated in the re-education programs, not out of conviction, but out of boredom or the promise of better treatment. They read American materials with skepticism, but also with curiosity. They were not converts, but neither were they true believers anymore. And for a minority, the cognitive dissonance was resolved by doubling down on Nazi ideology. These prisoners dismissed the evidence of their eyes, constructed elaborate explanations for American abundance and military success, and retreated into a fantasy world where Germany was still destined to win, and the propaganda must be true despite all evidence to the contrary. These were often the most dangerous. Prisoners, the ones who enforced Nazi discipline within the camps, who threatened or attacked doubters, who clung to Hitler as a drowning man clings to debris. The rodeo became a touchstone in conversations among prisoners. Remember how we didn't understand what we were seeing? Remember how it challenged what we thought we knew? Remember when we first began to doubt? For some prisoners, the rodeo was a joke evidence of American irrationality and waste. For others, it was a puzzle they kept returning to, trying to understand what it revealed about the nation that was defeating them. And for a few, it was a moment of clarity, when the ideological blinders fell away and they saw their enemy clearly for the first time. The historical record shows that American treatment of German POWs was remarkably effective at achieving its unstated objectives. Post-war surveys found that significant numbers of German prisoners returned home with more favorable views of the United States and democracy, and less favorable views of Nazi ideology. Some prisoners chose to return to America after repatriation to Germany, immigrating legally in the 1950s and becoming American citizens. The re-education program's effectiveness is debated by historians, but there is no question that exposure to American life had an impact on prisoner attitudes. The Rodeo incident, and the broader pattern of cultural confusion it represented, reveals something important about ideology and military culture in the Second World War. The German military was technically proficient, tactically skilled, and led by officers with extensive training and experience. But it served a totalitarian ideology that fundamentally misunderstood the nature of democratic societies. Nazi theorists believed that democracy was a weakness, that individualism undermined collective strength, that racial diversity prevented national unity. They believed that only through racial purity and totalitarian control could a nation achieve the unity necessary for modern warfare. The American experience proved them wrong. A diverse, individualistic, democratic society with a strong civilian culture proved perfectly capable of mobilizing for total war while maintaining the separations and freedoms that defined its character. Americans could attend rodeos and build aircraft carriers. They could celebrate individual achievement and coordinate massive military operations. They could maintain racial segregation that was morally indefensible, while also creating military units that fought effectively with men of all backgrounds. The contradictions that Nazi ideology claimed would destroy America instead turned out to be a source of adaptability and resilience. For the German prisoners at Camp Herne, the journey from ideological certainty to doubt played out against the backdrop of Germany's collapse. As 1944 progressed, into 1945, news from home became increasingly grim. Cities were being bombed into rubble. The Eastern Front was collapsing. Allied armies were advancing into Germany from east and west. Family letters, when they arrived at all, spoke of hunger, fear, and despair. The contrast between conditions in Germany and conditions in the Texas camps became impossible to ignore. Some prisoners felt guilty about their relative safety and abundance, while their families suffered. They had 3 meals a day, heated barracks, and no bombs falling on their heads. Meanwhile, their wives, children, and parents were enduring the final nightmare of the war's end. This guilt complicated the psychological adjustment process. Could they accept that their captors were right about Germany, about the Nazis, about the war, when doing so felt like a betrayal of the suffering people at home? Klaus Becker's final diary entry from his time at Camp Herne was written on May 8, 1925. Victory in Europe Day. He wrote, "Today the war ended. We received the news this morning. Some prisoners wept. Others seemed relieved. I do not know what I feel. Germany is defeated, occupied, destroyed. Everything we fought for is lost. And yet I find I cannot mourn for the cause. I think often of that rodeo we attended in October of '43. I did not understand what I was seeing. I thought it must serve some military purpose, because I could not imagine a nation doing anything that did not serve state power. The Americans have resources and strength because they have not sacrificed everything to the state. They have kept something for themselves, their ranches, their families, their foolish and dangerous entertainments. They are winning not despite these things, but perhaps because of them. A man who has something to return to will fight harder than a man who has only duty. We Germans were taught to sacrifice everything for the nation. The Americans sacrificed what was necessary and kept the rest. I think perhaps that is why they are standing and we have fallen. After the war, the German prisoners at Camp Hearn and other Texas camps were gradually repatriated between 1945 and 1947. The camps were dismantled, the buildings demolished or repurposed, the land returned to civilian use. But the impact of those years lingered. Some prisoners did return to the United States, seeking a new life in the country they had fought against, and then learned to understand. Others remained in Germany but carried with them memories of Texas, of abundance, of a different way of organizing society. The Texas prison rodeo continued until 1986, when structural problems with the stadium and changing attitudes about prisoner treatment led to its closure. It exists now only in photographs, memories, and historical records. The Poe camps are gone too, marked by historical plaques and the occasional archaeological investigation. But the encounter between German prisoners and Texas rodeo culture represents a moment when ideology collided with reality, when propaganda met first-hand experience, and when men began the difficult process of questioning everything they thought they knew. The broader lesson of the story extends beyond the specific historical moment. Totalitarian ideologies, by their nature, must construct simplified narratives about reality. They must claim that their enemies are weak, degenerate, or doomed. They must insist that their own methods are the only path to strength and victory. They must deny the possibility that alternative social organizations might be equally or more effective. When these ideologies encounter reality, when their adherents actually meet the enemies they have been taught to despise, the cognitive dissonance can be profound. For the German prisoners who witnessed that rodeo in October of 1943, the dissonance began with a simpler misunderstanding. They thought they were observing military training when they were actually witnessing cultural tradition. But that initial confusion opened the door to larger questions about the nature of American society, about the reliability of Nazi propaganda, and ultimately about the war itself. Some prisoners walked through that door and never looked back. Others lingered at the threshold, uncertain and conflicted, and a few slammed it shut and refused to acknowledge what they had seen. The historical record cannot tell us exactly what each prisoner thought or felt. We have some diaries, some letters, some post-war interviews and memoirs, but for most of these men, their internal struggles remain private, known only to themselves and perhaps to their families. What we can say with certainty is that the encounter mattered, that it challenged assumptions and opened possibilities for change. In the midst of a war that killed tens of millions and destroyed entire civilizations, a few thousand men watched cowboys ride bulls in a Texas prison rodeo and began to question the ideology that had sent them to war. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe. The morning of September 12th, 1942, Charter Towers Airfield, Queensland, Australia. The heat rises in waves off the tarmac as a Douglas A-20 Havoc light bomber taxis toward a makeshift hangar constructed from corrugated tin and hope. Inside that hangar, a 43-year-old man with grease-stained hands and fire in his eyes is about to change the Pacific War. His name is Paul Irvin Gunn. Everyone calls him Pappy. In 6 hours, the aircraft he's modified will attack a Japanese airfield at Buna, New Guinea. If his modifications work, American bombers will finally have the teeth they need to tear into Japanese shipping and ground installations. If they fail, men will die, and the innovative old pilot will be remembered as the fool who wasted precious time and resources on a crackpot idea. But Pappy Gunn isn't thinking about failure. He's thinking about his wife and 4 children, trapped 1,700 miles north in a Japanese internment camp at Santo Tomas in Manila. He's thinking about the convoy of Japanese transports he watched slip past American forces last week because no aircraft could get low enough, slow enough, and deadly enough to stop them. He's thinking about how a medium bomber designed to drop ordnance from 12,000 feet might be transformed into something the Japanese have never seen before. A low-level strafing monster that can shred ships, suppress anti-aircraft fire, and turn enemy airfields into graveyards. This is not the story of advanced technology solving a military problem. This is the story of a blacksmith's son from Arkansas who, armed with nothing but wrecked fighter planes, hand tools, and a desperate need to end a war that held his family hostage, turned America's medium bombers into the most feared gunships in the Pacific. This is the story of how improvisation defeated engineering, how necessity mothered an invention that would define close air support for generations, and how one man's fury transformed aluminum and guns into a weapon that would help shatter the Japanese Empire. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The North American B-25 Mitchell bomber was never supposed to be a gunship. When it rolled off the production line at the North American Aviation Plant in Inglewood, California, in 1941, it was designed as a medium bomber, a workhorse aircraft meant to deliver substantial bomb loads economically and accurately from moderate altitudes between 8,000 and 12,000 feet. Twin Wright R2600 engines, 64 feet from nose to tail, 95-foot wingspan, loaded weight of 33,000 pounds, maximum speed of 230 miles per hour, range of 1,300 miles. The Mitchell was a solid, reliable aircraft, named after Brigadier General William Billy Mitchell, the charismatic air power prophet, who proved in 1921 that planes could sink battleships. It carried a crew of 6, pilot, co-pilot, bombardier/navigator, radio operator, and 2 gunners. Its defensive armament included a tail gun, a dorsal turret, and a ventral gun tray that took almost a minute to extend, by which time a Zero fighter could make 3 attack passes. The waist guns posed as much danger to the Mitchell's own vertical tails and engine nacelles as they did to enemy fighters. The aircraft was thoroughly conventional, thoroughly tested, and thoroughly inadequate for the kind of war being fought in the Southwest Pacific in 1942. In the jungles and islands of New Guinea and the Solomon Islands, altitude was a luxury American bomber crews could rarely afford. The jungle environment reduced the usefulness of medium-level bombing. Flying at 10,000 feet, a bombardier might spot a ship, an airfield, or a supply dump, but actually hitting it through the dense canopy in the face of anti-aircraft fire while being harassed by Zeros was another matter entirely. Bombs dropped from altitude scattered. Many disappeared into the jungle without detonating. Others landed harmlessly in water. The few that found targets often caused minimal damage because they lacked the precision to strike vulnerable points. Meanwhile, Japanese supply convoys were running nightly, sustaining isolated garrisons, reinforcing threatened positions, and delivering troops and equipment throughout their sprawling Pacific empire. American submarines were taking a toll, but submarines couldn't be everywhere. The US Army Air Forces needed a way to hammer these convoys from the air, to deny the Japanese the freedom of movement that geography seemed to grant them. They needed aircraft that could fly low, loiter over targets, suppress defensive fire, and deliver devastating attacks against ships and shore installations. The problem was that no such aircraft existed in the American inventory in mid-1942. Fighters like the P-40 Warhawk and P-39 Airacobra had the speed and maneuverability for low-level attacks, but they lacked the range, the punch, and the survivability to sustain operations against well-defended targets. Heavy bombers, like the B-17 Flying Fortress, were designed for high-altitude strategic bombing, not low-level ship-busting. Light bombers like the Douglas A-20 Havoc showed promise, but they were in short supply. The B-25 Mitchell medium bomber was available in increasing numbers, but it was designed for a completely different mission profile. What the 5th Air Force needed was an aircraft that combined the range and payload of a medium bomber with the forward-firing punch of a fighter. They needed something that could approach targets at wave-top height, suppress anti-aircraft fire with streams of heavy machine gun fire, and then either strafe the target to pieces or skip bomb it with 500-pound bombs released so low they bounced across the water like stones before slamming into ship hulls below the waterline. They needed a gunship, and they needed it in weeks, not months, not years, because every week of delay meant more Japanese supply runs, more reinforced positions, or dead American and Australian soldiers on jungle battlefields, where air support meant the difference between survival and annihilation. Enter Major General George C. Kenny, who arrived in Australia in August 1942 to take command of Allied air forces in the Southwest Pacific Theatre. Kenny was 53 years old, a veteran of the First World War, and a man with no patience for orthodoxy when orthodoxy was getting his men killed. He immediately began touring his scattered bases, looking for solutions to the tactical problems that were bleeding his bomber force white. At Charter Towers Airfield, south of Townsville in Queensland, he found something interesting. A grease-stained former Navy pilot in his early 40s, working in a shelter on a Douglas A-20 Havoc, converting it from a light bomber into something else entirely. Paul Irvin Gunn, called Pappy by everyone who knew him, because at 43 he was ancient by Air Force standards, was unlike any officer Kenny had ever met. Gunn had enlisted in the Navy in 1918, served 21 years as an aviation mechanic and then a naval aviation pilot, and retired in December 1939 as a chief petty officer. He was an expert in low-level flying, a gifted aircraft mechanic, and a man who understood airplanes the way a blacksmith understands iron because he could shape them with his hands. After leaving the Navy, Gunn had moved his family to the Philippines, where he helped start Philippine Airlines, flying 5 privately owned Beechcraft aircraft on cargo and passenger routes throughout the islands. When the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, Gunn was in Manila. Major General Louis Brereton, commander of the Far East Air Force, immediately commandeered Philippine Airlines aircraft and personnel. Gunn was sworn into the Army Air Corps as a captain, given command of a makeshift air transport squadron, and ordered to evacuate military personnel from Japanese-held territory. For the next 6 weeks, Gunn flew mission after mission into hostile airspace in unarmored Beechcraft planes, bringing out pilots, ferrying supplies to besieged troops on Bataan, and performing feats of low-level flying that earned him a reputation as either the bravest or the craziest pilot in the Philippines. He survived being shot down once, crashing into a coconut plantation and being rescued by the plantation owner, someone he'd flown as a passenger during peacetime. Eventually, in late January 1942, Gunn flew one of the last aircraft out of the Philippines to Australia, carrying key personnel to safety. But he left something behind. His wife, Clara Louise, and their 4 children Nathaniel, Connie, Julie, and Paul Jr. were trapped in Manila when the city fell. On January 20th, 1942, the Japanese rounded up American and Allied civilians and interned them at the University of Santo Tomas. Papi Gunn's family would remain prisoners there for 3 years, living on starvation rations, subject to brutal discipline, slowly wasting away while he fought from Australia, unable to reach them, unable to protect them, able only to kill as many Japanese as possible in the desperate hope that ending the war faster might save their lives. This was the man General Kenny found working on an A-20 in a tin shelter at Charter Towers in August 1942. This was the man who, when asked what he was doing, explained that he was installing 4 50-caliber machine guns into the bombardier's nose, replacing the transparent plexiglass with solid metal, and transforming the light bomber into a low-level strafer that could suppress anti-aircraft fire and tear enemy aircraft and installations to pieces. Kenny asked where Gunn had gotten the machine guns. Gunn explained that he was scavenging them from wrecked fighters, scattered across Australian airfields, P-40 Warhawks, and P-39 Airacobras damaged beyond repair, but with functional weapons. The 5th Air Force supply of 50-caliber machine guns was severely limited throughout the Southwest Pacific. There were never enough. So Gunn did what any good mechanic does. He improvised. He found wrecks. He salvaged guns. He fabricated mounts. He tested, adjusted, tested again. He made it work because making it work was the only option. General Kenny was impressed. This old sailor understood something that headquarters staff in comfortable offices never would. That war is not won by following procedures, but by solving problems, and that the best solutions often come from people who know their tools intimately enough to bend them to new purposes. Kenny immediately placed Gunn on his personal staff as Special Projects Officer and gave him a simple mandate: convert more aircraft, make them deadlier, do it fast. Gunn set to work with a fury that astonished everyone around him. He wasn't just an engineer solving a technical problem. He was a father trying to save his family by shortening a war. Every aircraft he modified, every sortie that aircraft flew, every Japanese ship sunk or airfield destroyed, brought the war closer to Manila, closer to Santo Tomas, closer to his wife and children. Fury is a powerful motivator. Desperation is an even more powerful engineer. By early September 1942, Gunn had converted several A-20s into strafers. The modifications were crude but effective. 4 50-caliber Browning M2 machine guns mounted in the nose, solid metal panels replacing the bombardier's transparent station, additional ammunition storage, bomb racks modified to carry parachute fragmentation bombs, small bombs slowed by parachutes so the attacking aircraft could escape the blast radius even at ultra-low altitude. The parafrag bombs would float gently down over enemy airfields and installations, exploding above parked aircraft and fuel dumps, showering them with red-hot fragments and white phosphorus that set fire to everything the fragments touched. The converted A-20s were tested in combat on September 12, 1942, in a raid against the Japanese airfield at Buna, New Guinea. The results exceeded every expectation. Flying at wave-top height and treetop level, the strafers roared in before defenders could react, suppressing anti-aircraft fire with streams of 50-caliber armor-piercing rounds. then releasing their parafrag bombs directly over the target. Japanese fighters caught on the ground exploded, fuel dumps detonated, buildings disintegrated. The lightly constructed Japanese aircraft, built for agility and range, not armor, tore apart under the half-inch bullets traveling at 2,900 feet per second. The strafers pulled up and away, leaving behind a trail of destruction that looked like the wrath of an angry god. General Kenny immediately ordered Gunn to do the same thing to the B-25 Mitchell. This was a bigger challenge. The A-20 was a light bomber, relatively small, relatively easy to modify. The B-25 was a medium bomber, larger, more complex, with different aerodynamics and structural considerations. Adding weight to the nose of an aircraft affects its center of gravity, which affects its stability and handling. Installing guns creates recoil forces that must be absorbed by the airframe. Modifying a bomber designed for high-altitude level flight to perform low-level strafing runs meant accepting risks that no engineer at North American Aviation would have approved. But Pappy Gunn didn't work for North American Aviation. He worked for General Kenny. And General Kenny didn't care about what the manual said was possible. He cared about what needed to be done. Gunn was assisted by Jack Fox, a North American Aviation technical representative based at Charter Towers. Fox sent drawings of Gunn's proposed modifications back to the factory in Long Beach, California, but there were too few B-25s in the theater to spare any for modification experiments yet. The first B-25s were needed for conventional bombing missions. Gunn would have to wait for more aircraft to arrive before he could begin the conversions that would define the rest of the Pacific Air War. The waiting was agony. Every day meant more supply runs, more reinforcements, more American soldiers dying on jungle battlefields, more time his family spent in that internment camp. Gunn flew combat missions himself, testing his A-20 conversions, refining the tactics, and proving the concept. He flew more missions than almost any other man in theater, accumulating combat hours and enemy kills, earning 2 distinguished flying crosses, the Silver Star, the Legion of Merit, the Air Medal, and eventually 9 Purple Hearts, 9 separate wounds. 9 times he bled in combat and kept flying. By late 1942, B-25 Mitchells were arriving in Australia in greater numbers. General Kenny authorized Gunn to begin the conversion program. Working with a small team of mechanics, Gunn established a B-25 conversion center at Townsville. The modifications were extensive. Remove the transparent bombardier's nose. Replace it with solid metal panels. Install 8 50 caliber Browning machine guns, 4 in the nose, 4 in underwing blisters or fuselage packages. Some aircraft received additional guns, 2 more forward-firing guns in cheek blisters on either side of the nose, bringing the total forward-firing armament to 10 or even 12 heavy machine guns. Add the dorsal turret's 2 guns, which could be synchronized to fire forward with the fixed guns, and some B-25s could bring 14 50 caliber machine guns to bear on a target simultaneously. 14 50 caliber machine guns. Each gun fires 850 rounds per minute. Each round a half-inch diameter armor-piercing projectile traveling at 2,900 feet per second. 14 guns equaled 11,900 rounds per minute, nearly 200 rounds per second, creating a cone of destruction so dense that anything caught within it simply disintegrated. The conversions took time. Weeks, not overnight. Not a single desperate night of improvisation, but a sustained program of modification and testing. Each aircraft had to be carefully modified to maintain structural integrity. The guns had to be aligned, tested, adjusted. Ammunition feed systems had to be installed and debugged. Pilots had to learn new tactics for an aircraft that now handled differently, weighed more in the nose, and required different flying techniques to compensate for the weight of all those guns and all that ammunition. But the results, when they came, were devastating. The first squadron of Strafer B-25s was ready for combat in early 1943. They would prove their worth in the most dramatic fashion imaginable. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea, one of the most one-sided victories in the history of naval aviation. A battle that would demonstrate beyond any doubt that Papillon's jury-rigged gunships had changed the Pacific War forever. The first days of March, 1943, intelligence reports reached General Kenny's headquarters in Port Moresby, New Guinea. A Japanese convoy is assembling at Rabaul 8 transport ships, carrying nearly 7,000 troops, escorted by 8 destroyers. Destination: Lae, New Guinea, where Japanese forces are under pressure from Allied advances. The convoy represents a massive reinforcement effort, enough troops to turn the tide of the ground campaign, and enough supplies to sustain Japanese resistance for months. General Kenny knows what he has to do. The convoy must be destroyed, not damaged, not delayed, destroyed. Every ship, every soldier, every ton of supplies. Because if those 7,000 troops reach Lae, American and Australian soldiers will pay for it in blood on jungle battlefields where the enemy already holds every advantage terrain can provide. Kenny has the aircraft to do it. He has B-17 Flying Fortresses for high-altitude bombing. He has B-25 Mitchells, both conventional bombers and Pappy guns starter conversions. He has A-20 Havocs, similarly modified. He has P-38 Lightning fighters for escort and strafing. And he has a new tactic that has been tested in smaller engagements, but never against a target this large, this well-defended, this important. Skip bombing. The concept is simple in theory, terrifying in execution. A bomber approaches its target at extremely low altitude, 200 feet or less, sometimes as low as 50 feet above the waves. At point-blank range, perhaps a quarter mile from the target, the bomber releases its bombs with a slight upward trajectory. The bombs skip across the water like flat stones thrown by children at a pond, except these stones weigh 500 pounds and contain high explosives. They skip once, twice, then slam into the ship's hull at or below the waterline, exactly where naval architects know a ship is most vulnerable. The explosion opens the hull to the sea. The ship floods. The ship sinks. But skip bombing requires pilots to fly directly at heavily armed warships through walls of anti-aircraft fire, low enough that a single mistake means hitting the water and disintegrating, slow enough that enemy gunners have time to aim, close enough that if the bomb detonates prematurely, the attacking aircraft gets caught in its own blast. It requires nerves of steel and perfect timing. It requires aircraft that can suppress the anti-aircraft fire long enough for the bomber to release its ordnance and escape. It requires Papillon's Strafer B-25s. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea begins on March 2nd, 1943. The Japanese convoy departs Rabaul, steaming southwest through the Solomon Sea toward the Huon Gulf and Lae. Australian reconnaissance aircraft spot the convoy and shadow it, reporting position and course. General Kenny mobilizes his air groups. Bombers and fighters take off from bases throughout New Guinea and northern Australia. The weather is terrible, heavy clouds, rain squalls, poor visibility. But the weather works in the Allies' favour, allowing aircraft to approach unseen until the last moment. The first attacks are conventional. B-17 Flying Fortresses bomb from altitude on March 2nd, and third, scoring few hits but forcing the convoy to maneuver constantly, slowing its progress. Then the weather clears on the morning of March 3rd, and Kenny unleashes the strafers. The modified B-25s and A-20s come in low, so low that their propellers are churning spray from the wavetops. They approach in formation, a wall of aircraft bearing down on the convoy at 200 miles per hour. The Japanese ships see them coming. Anti-aircraft guns open fire. 20mm and 25mm cannons throw up walls of explosive shells. Heavier 40mm guns pump rounds in arcing trajectories. The sky fills with tracer fire, with black puffs of exploding shells, with the smoke and fury of desperate defense, and then the strafers open fire. 14 50-caliber machine guns per aircraft, multiple aircraft attacking simultaneously, thousands of rounds per second hammering into Japanese ships. The effect is apocalyptic. Anti-aircraft gun crews are scythed down where they stand. Gun shields are perforated like paper. Bridge windows shatter. Superstructures are shredded. The armor-piercing rounds punch through light armor, ricochet off steel bulkheads, tear through wooden structures, set fires, detonate ammunition. The Japanese gunners who survived the initial onslaught find themselves suppressed, unable to aim, unable to fire, forced to take cover as half-inch bullets tear apart everything around them. And in that window of suppressed fire, the skip-bombing B-25s and conventional Mitchells release their loads. 500-pound bombs skip across the water. Some miss war is never perfect, but many hit. They slam into hulls below the waterline. They explode with the force of half a ton of high explosive concentrated against the weakest part of the ship's structure. Steel plates buckle. Welds fail. The sea pours in. The transport ships, heavily laden with troops and supplies, are particularly vulnerable. They're not warships. They don't have armored hulls or sophisticated damage control. When the bombs hit, when the hulls open to the Pacific, they begin sinking immediately. Troops below decks, trapped in compartments that are flooding, have nowhere to go. The ships settle lower in the water, list to one side, then capsize or break apart and slide beneath the waves. The destroyers fare better their warships, designed to take punishment, but even they cannot withstand the coordinated assault. One destroyer takes a bomb amidships and breaks in half. Another is so riddled with 50-caliber fire that it becomes unmanageable, drifting in circles as fires rage unchecked. A third destroyer, trying to rescue survivors from a sinking transport, is caught by strafers and turned into a funeral pyre. The battle continues for 3 days. Every time the Japanese try to rescue survivors, Allied aircraft appear. Every time a damaged ship tries to limp away, it's attacked again. The strafer B-25s hunt like wolves, working in coordination with conventional bombers, with fighters, with reconnaissance aircraft spotting targets. They use the new parachute fragmentation bombs, floating them down over the decks of destroyers, killing exposed personnel, starting fires, creating chaos. They strafe lifeboats and debris fields not out of cruelty, but because those survivors are soldiers who, if rescued, will fight again on New Guinea's battlefields. By March 4th, the Battle of the Bismarck Sea was over. The results are staggering. All 8 transport ships sunk, 4 destroyers sunk, 3 others heavily damaged. Approximately 3,000 Japanese soldiers were killed in the sinking ships or in the water. Fewer than 1,000 reach land, and most of those are immediately captured or killed by Allied forces. The reinforcement effort is annihilated. The supplies that were supposed to sustain the Japanese garrison at Leh for months are at the bottom of the Bismarck Sea. Allied losses: 4 aircraft shot down, 13 aircrew killed or missing. It is one of the most one-sided victories in the history of warfare. And at the center of it, making it possible, are Pappy Guns modified B-25s, the strafers that suppressed defensive fire, that allowed the skip bombers to approach, that tore Japanese ships apart with concentrated machine gun fire. General Kenny immediately orders more conversions. Word spreads throughout the theatre. Other air forces want the strafers. The 13th Air Force sends B-25s to Brisbane for conversion. Depot engineers at Tontota begin modifying aircraft. The 10th Air Force in India picks up the modifications. What began as one man's desperate improvisation in a tin hangar in Queensland becomes standard practice across the Pacific. But the story doesn't end with tactical success, because North American aviation, back in California, has been watching. The factory representatives have been sending reports about guns modifications. Engineers in Long Beach have been studying the results, and they've begun incorporating guns innovations into new production models. In late 1943, North American introduced the B-25G model. The transparent nose is gone, replaced by a solid metal nose housing a 75mm M4 cannon, a tank gun, mounted in an aircraft, firing 3-pound high-explosive shells that can engage ships from 2 miles away and sink smaller vessels with a single hit. 4 50-caliber machine guns supplement the cannon. The concept is innovative. The execution is problematic. The 75mm cannon produces tremendous recoil. Each time it fires, the entire aircraft shudders. Pilots struggle to keep the aircraft stable. The cannon is manually loaded, slow to reload, and quickly exhausts its limited ammunition supply. After 7 weeks of combat, units equipped with the B-25G have expended all their 75mm ammunition. The cannon-armed Mitchells are an interesting experiment, but ultimately they prove less effective than Pappy Gun's simpler solution: more machine guns. The B-25H model appears next 1,000 aircraft built with even more machine guns. The 75mm cannon is replaced with a lighter 14-gun version, 8 in the nose, 4 in side blisters, 2 in the dorsal turret. Some H models also carry rockets, 5-inch high-velocity aircraft rockets, that can be ripple-fired in devastating salvos. But the ultimate expression of Pappy Gun's vision is the B-25J, introduced in 1944. North American builds over 4,000 J models. Many are delivered with transparent noses for conventional bombing, but the air depot system creates conversion kits, the strafer nose option. When a J model is converted to a strafer, it carries 18 50-caliber machine guns, 8 in the nose, 4 in the fuselage packages, 2 in the dorsal turret, 1 in each waist position, and 2 in the tail. 14 of those 18 guns fire directly forward, 18 50-caliber machine guns on a single aircraft, 15,300 rounds per minute combined rate of fire, over 250 rounds per second. A B-25J strafer, firing all forward guns simultaneously, puts more lead into the air than an entire infantry company could fire with their rifles. The effect on targets is not destruction, it's disintegration. These heavily armed Mitchells continued to devastate Japanese targets throughout New Guinea, the Philippines, and Okinawa until the end of the war. They strafe airfields, destroying parked aircraft. They attack bridges, severing supply lines. They hunt coastal barges and small vessels. They support ground troops with devastating close air support. They are so effective that captured enemy documents warn Japanese forces not to attack when the strafers or overhead weapons are useless against them, and attacking will only infuriate the monsters. The strafer crews develop their own tactics and their own reputation. They fly low enough to see the expressions on enemy soldiers' faces. They approach from unexpected angles over mountains, up valleys, along coastlines, using terrain to mask their approach until the last second. They work in coordination with each other, one aircraft suppressing fire while another delivers the killing blow. They are feared, they are hated, they are merciless, and behind every one of those aircraft is Pappy Gunn's desperate fury, channeled into engineering, transformed into lethality. Major Gunn promoted for his innovations, and his combat record is eventually sent back to the United States to oversee factory production of the new B-25 variants at North American Aviation. It's a recognition of his contributions, an acknowledgement that his field modifications have been so successful they need to be incorporated into production aircraft. But Gunn doesn't want recognition. He wants to be in the Pacific, fighting, killing Japanese, shortening the war that holds his family hostage. He returns to the Pacific as soon as he can. He continues flying combat missions. He continues taking risks that make his commanders nervous. In late 1944, a Japanese bombing attack on Leyte in the Philippines catches him on the ground. He's wounded his 9th Purple Heart badly enough that he's removed from active combat. The war continues without him, but by then, the strafer program he pioneered is so thoroughly integrated into Pacific air operations that it no longer needs him. In February 1945, American forces liberated Manila. They fight house to house, building to building, against fanatical Japanese defenders who would rather die than surrender. On February 3rd, American troops reached the University of Santo Tomas. They find over 3,000 internees, starving, sick, traumatized by 3 years of captivity. Among them are Clara Louise Gunn and her 4 children. Pappy Gunn is reunited with his family. They're alive, barely, malnourished, traumatized, forever marked by their ordeal, but alive. The war he fought to shorten, the modifications he made, the missions he flew, the Japanese he killed, all of it was for this moment. His family survives. The Philippines are liberated. The war grinds toward its conclusion. Gunn retired from the Army Air Forces as a full colonel on June 30th, 1948, medically retired due to his accumulated wounds. He returns to the Philippines to rebuild Philippine Airlines, the airline he helped start before the war. The company expands, provides flights across the South Pacific, and becomes one of the region's major carriers. Gunn flies again, not in combat but in commerce, carrying passengers and cargo instead of guns and fury. On October 11, 1957, Colonel Paul Irvin Pappy Gunn died when his chartered Beech 18 crashed in a storm over the Philippines. He's 57 years old. He's survived 21 years in the Navy, 5 years of brutal combat in the Pacific War, 9 combat wounds, countless close calls, and the loss of nearly everything he cared about during the dark years when his family was imprisoned. A storm over the islands he loved finally claims him, but his legacy endures. The strafer concept he pioneered doesn't die with him. During the Korean War, modified B-25s provided close air support using the same tactics Gunn developed. The principal heavy forward-firing armament on a stable platform becomes doctrine. In the 1960s, when the United States began developing gunships for Vietnam, the engineers looked back at Pappy Gunn's work. They study his modifications. They understand his insight, that sometimes the best weapon isn't the newest or the most technologically advanced, but the one that puts the most firepower exactly where it needs to be. The AC-47 Spooky, the first modern gunship, uses sideways-firing guns and a pylon-turn, a different approach than guns forward-firing strafers, but the same understanding that transport and bomber aircraft can be converted into devastating gunships. The AC-130 Spectre, still flying today with 105mm howitzers and sophisticated targeting systems, is a direct descendant of Gunn's vision. Take an aircraft designed for one purpose, modify it for another, and create a weapon so effective it changes how wars are fought. Every Air Force close air support doctrine written since the 1940s acknowledges, implicitly or explicitly, that Pappy Gunn was right, that desperation can produce innovation, that field modifications can outpace factory design, that the side willing to improvise, to break rules, to transform its tools into weapons its enemies have never seen, holds an advantage that technology alone cannot provide. The irony is profound and multi-layered. A bomber designed to drop ordnance from altitude becomes a low-level strafer. A former Navy pilot, retired and running a civilian airline, becomes one of the most innovative weapons designers of the war. An aircraft modification program born from desperation and scavenged parts became the foundation for gunship doctrine used for 80 years. A man fighting to save his family helps destroy an empire. And perhaps the deepest irony, the B-25 Mitchell, which Pappy Gunn modified so dramatically, was never supposed to be a close air support aircraft. It was supposed to deliver bombs from medium altitude. It was supposed to be safe, orthodox, and conventional. But orthodoxy doesn't win wars. Innovation does. Desperation does. Fury channeled into engineering. The morning of September 12, 1942, Pappy Gunn's modified A-20 attacked Buna. The raid succeeded beyond all expectations. But Gunn wasn't celebrating. He was already planning. The next modification, the next improvement, the next innovation. Because every day the war continued was another day his family spent in that camp. Every sortie his aircraft flew, every enemy position his modifications destroyed, brought the end closer. War is often portrayed as a story of grand strategy, of decisive battles, of great commanders moving armies like pieces on a chessboard. But wars are also won in tin hangars in the Australian heat, by middle-aged former sailors with grease under their fingernails and fury in their hearts, by men who understand that sometimes the difference between victory and defeat is simply being willing to look at an aircraft, a perfectly good, conventional, orthodox aircraft, and ask, what if we added more guns? Pappy Gunn asked that question. He answered it with a wrench and a welding torch, and the Japanese Empire paid the price in blood and steel at the bottom of the Bismarck Sea. The B-25 Mitchell flew in every theatre of the Second World War. It participated in the Doolittle raid on Tokyo. It bombed targets across Europe, Africa, and Asia. It served with distinction in dozens of air forces around the world. Nearly 10,000 were built. It was reliable. It was versatile. It was loved by its crews. But in the Southwest Pacific, the Mitchell was something more. It was a gunship. It was a ship killer. It was a terror weapon that forced the Japanese to abandon daylight supply runs, to scatter their convoys, to accept that American air power could reach them anywhere, any time, and turn their ships into funeral pyres. And all of it, the tactics, the modifications, the victories, traces back to one man who refused to accept that his family's imprisonment was inevitable, who refused to accept that the war would last as long as orthodox thinking suggested, who refused to accept that aircraft had to be used the way their designers intended. Paul Irvin Pappy Gunn didn't invent the gunship overnight in a moment of desperate improvisation. He developed it over months of trial and error, testing and refinement, combat experience and engineering insight. But he did it faster than any official program could have. He did it with salvaged parts and improvised solutions. He did it because he had to, because every delay meant his family suffered, because fury is a powerful engineer when channeled through skill and determination. The Strafer B-25s weren't perfect. They were nose-heavy. They handled differently than conventional Mitchells. The recoil from firing all those guns simultaneously was violent enough to slow the aircraft noticeably. Ammunition consumption was enormous. A Strafer could expend its entire load in seconds of sustained fire. The aircraft were vulnerable to ground fire because they flew so low. Crews died. Aircraft were lost. War is never clean, never easy, never without cost. But the Strafers worked. They changed the Pacific War. They allowed American forces to interdict Japanese supply lines, to support ground troops with devastating precision, and to destroy enemy installations before defenders could respond. They saved lives, American, Australian, and Allied lives, by shortening battles, by preventing reinforcements from reaching embattled garrisons, by giving ground forces the air support they desperately needed. And every time a Strafer B-25 dove toward a Japanese ship or airfield, every time those 14 machine guns opened fire and the target disintegrated under concentrated fire, it was Pappy Gunn's fury made manifest. It was a father's desperation transformed into engineering. It was improvisation defeating orthodoxy. It was proof that sometimes the best solutions come not from careful planning but from having no other choice. The Pacific War ended on August 15, 1945, with Japan's surrender. Pappy Gunn's family was free. The Strafer B-25s had helped bring that moment closer. How much closer? Impossible to calculate. But every ship sunk, every airfield destroyed, every battle shortened contributed to the cumulative pressure that forced Japan to accept the unacceptable. Wars are won by many factors: strategy, logistics, industrial production, courage, sacrifice. But they're also won by individuals who see problems and solve them, who refuse to accept limitations, who transform ordinary tools into extraordinary weapons. Pappy Gunn was such an individual. His contribution to victory wasn't a single decisive battle. It was hundreds of modifications, thousands of sorties, tens of thousands of enemy casualties inflicted by aircraft he transformed. The B-25 Mitchell bomber was a good aircraft. Pappy Gunn made it a great one. Not by sophisticated engineering or advanced technology, but by asking a simple question: what does this aircraft need to do the job that needs doing? The answer was more guns. More forward-firing, heavy machine guns, capable of suppressing enemy fire and destroying targets with overwhelming firepower. So he added more guns. He added them with wrenches and welding torches, with salvaged parts and improvised mounts, with ingenuity born of desperation and refined through combat experience. And the result changed warfare. 80 years later, the United States Air Force still operates gunships based on principles Pappy Gunn pioneered. The platforms are different turboprop transports instead of piston-engine bombers. The weapons are more sophisticated cannons, howitzers, precision-guided munitions. The targeting systems use radar, infrared sensors, and computers that would have seemed like magic to Gunn's generation. But the fundamental insight remains unchanged. A transport or bomber aircraft, properly modified, can deliver sustained, devastating firepower against ground targets with a precision and intensity that other platforms cannot match. Every AC-130 gunship pilot owes a debt to Pappy Gunn. every close air support, controller calling in fire from circling gunships is using tactics refined in the skies over New Guinea and the Bismarck Sea. Every innovation in aerial gunnery stands on foundations, gun laid in a tin hangar in Queensland, working with hand tools and fury. This is not the story of advanced technology defeating primitive enemy equipment. The Japanese were not unsophisticated. Their aircraft were excellent, their ships were well armed, their pilots were skilled and courageous. They understood warfare as well as anyone. But they didn't have Pappy Gun. They didn't have a blacksmith's son from Arkansas who understood aircraft intimately enough to transform them, who was desperate enough to try unconventional solutions, who was furious enough to work 18-hour days modifying bombers because every hour of delay was an hour his family spent in captivity. The Japanese fought bravely, they fought skillfully, they fought with everything they had. But they couldn't adapt as fast as Gun could innovate. They couldn't counter tactics they'd never seen before. And when those Strafer B-25s came in at wave-top height, guns blazing, bombs skipping across the water toward their hulls, all the courage and skill in the world couldn't save them. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.